We're going to talk about the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of a conditional statement. Remember, conditional statements are if-then statements. So for instance, if I say if a four-sided figure has four 90-degree angles, then it is a rectangle. That is a conditional statement. And from that conditional statement, we can find its converse, we can find its inverse, and can find its contrapositive. So first, let's define what those terms mean, and then we're going to do two examples. Okay, so converse, you're going to think change order. So CO, change order. So you're going to switch the hypothesis and conclusion. Okay, of your conditional statement. All right, so let's start with the conditional statement. Let's actually work and start with the conditional statement. So we're going to put the original statement here. All right, let's write it up here. So let's put, if you are a sophomore, oh, I don't know if I know how to spell sophomore. All right, let's put 10th grader, because I don't know how to spell sophomore. If you're a 10th grader, then you are in geometry. Okay, so let's say that's our original statement. So if we do the converse of that, we're going to switch the hypothesis, which is you are a 10th grader, and the conclusion, which is you are in geometry. So we write it in separate order. So we're going to put if you are in geometry, capital G, oops, geometry, come on, there we go, then you are a 10th grader. All right, so that is the converse. So you just switch the hypothesis and conclusion. For inverse, you negate. So inverse, negate. So we're going to put switch. Actually, no, we're not. So inverse, you negate. So you negate the hypothesis and conclusion. All right. So for our example, we would put if you are not a 10th grader, then you are not in geometry. All right, so that's inverse. Inverse, you negate. Converse, you change order. You switch the hypothesis and conclusion. And then finally, contrapositive, which is a really long word. I always say your contrapositive long words, you do both. You switch and negate the hypothesis and the conclusion. So switch, and that is not how you spell switch. Switch and negate the hypothesis and conclusion. So we're going to do both things. And so for our example, we would put, if you're not in geometry, so we're going to negate and write the conclusion first. Then you are not a 10th grader. Okay, so conversely switch. So you just put the conclusion first, hypothesis second. Notice, but it's still if then. It's just now if the conclusion, then the hypothesis. Inverse, you negate. So if not the hypothesis, then not the conclusion. And then contrapositive, you switch and negate the hypothesis conclusion. So if not the conclusion, then not the hypothesis. All right, so let's do a couple more examples. So let's do another original. All right, so we'll put, if you live in Yorktown, then you live in Virginia. Okay, so converse. All right, so again, we switch and negate. No, we just switch. Sorry, we switch the hypothesis and conclusion. So we're going to put if the conclusion. So if you live in Virginia, then you live in Yorktown. All right. Inverse. We're going to switch and negate. If you do not live in Yorktown, then you do not live in Virginia. Okay. And then finally, contrapositive. Switch and negate. So we're going to say, if you do not live in Virginia. Then you do not live in Yorktown. All right. So one of the things we do want to talk about with these is truth values of statements. So let's say Yorktown, I want to guess, and I'm probably wrong, and you probably can Google this and realize I'm wrong, but the only Yorktown in the country is the one in Virginia. So let's say it's 100% true that if you live in Yorktown, then you live in Virginia. So let's say that is true. So we'll say that's a true statement. My if-then statement is true. All right. All right. Does it have to be true that if you live in Virginia, then you live in Yorktown? Well, no. I could live in Richmond, I could live in Norfolk, I can live in Tab, I could live in Newport News. So this is not necessarily true. And I have a counterexample. I could say, you live in Newport News, because I live in Virginia if I live in Newport News, but it's not true that I live in Yorktown. Not all Virginians live in Yorktown. All right, so if you think about it, if you have to think of a Venn diagram, here's all the people that live in Virginia, and then here's all the people that live in Yorktown. Okay? Inverse. If you do not live in Yorktown, then you do not live in Virginia. So here's people who live in Yorktown, but again, I could live in Richmond. Okay, I don't live in Yorktown, but I still live in Virginia, so that's a counterexample. So that's also false. As long as you can find a counterexample, then your statement is false. All right, so finally, let's look at the contrapositive. If you do not live in Virginia, then you do not live in Yorktown. Okay, so if I don't live in Virginia, then I can't be in Yorktown, because the only Yorktown is in Virginia. So I say, oh no, I don't live in Virginia. Then a person can say, well, they can't live in Yorktown then. So this is also, no, this is true, just like the original statement. Okay, you notice the original statement and the contrapositive have the same truth value. All right, so again, converse, you switch the hypothesis and conclusion. Inverse, you negate the hypothesis and conclusion. Contrapositive, you switch and you negate the hypothesis and conclusion. And a statement is true as long as you will consider true. Unless you can find a counterexample, then we can say, hey, well, that cannot be a true statement.